So my name is Adam Crain. Thanks for sticking around for the last session. I'm glad I was introduced as a software engineer because I'm really not a security guy or security researcher. I'm a consulting software engineer, mostly within electric power in the United States. But I would say over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been kind of keenly getting interested in security in that space because I've seen a lot of funky things in the systems I consult on. So I'm here to talk today about Secure SCADA Protocol for the 21st Century, or SSP-21. I know that's an acronym within an acronym. Just, swallow it and like it. I didn't name the protocol. And it's part of an umbrella project from 3 major investor-owned utilities in California, and that project is called California Energy Systems for the 21st Century, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So a little bit of legalese there you can read on your own later. CS21 is sort of a cooperative R&D project where 3 utilities, San Diego Gas and Electric, Pacific Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison, came together with Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and they went all the way up to the Public Utility Commission, being a regulated industry, and said, we want a research budget for a 3-year project. And there's 10 different projects going on underneath that umbrella. So if anyone's interested, I think there's a link at the end of the document, things like automated threat response, all kinds of topics, and SSP21 is just one of those sub-projects. And I hope that seeing that there's 4 organizations that are all operating on a CRADA makes you understand how difficult it was for me to get these slides approved, because I literally have to go to 4 entities and everybody has to sign off. So that's what CES21 is. So before this project kicked off, it was really San Diego Gas and Electric was kind of looking at what the industry had to offer for electric power in terms of secure protocols. And even before I was onboarded as a consultant on this project, they had already come to certain decisions. There are really 2 classes of protocols other than TLS or standard IT wrappers that are currently being offered. You have kind of things derived from IEC 62351-5, and that's sort of a meta standard that says, given these cryptographic building blocks and these patterns, here's how you sprinkle security into legacy SCADA protocols. And that's really the way I would frame it in the way that they've done it. They've literally kind of taken those existing protocols and added extra objects in that represent things like message authentication codes and so forth. And then you have wrapper protocols that take the whole protocol and wrap it up. And there may be IEC equivalents, but in IEEE, those are the 1711 series protocols, SSP and SSCP. And the primary driver there is to be able to support serial communication infrastructure, to be able to do things with, so you can put a bump in the wire in place and have kind of low latency where you're not kind of slowing down message flows. With the 62351 series of protocols, I'll tell you a dirty little secret. 62351 wasn't written prior to DNP3 secure authentication. So that was actually backed out of DNP3 SA. So the consultant who designed DNP3 SA was actually retroactively hired by IEC to create IEC 62351, which was then modified so that the TC57 folks could use that to design the sort of the secure flavor of 101 and 104. I view these efforts to kind of add crypto into existing legacy protocols as well-intentioned but a little bit misguided. They're extremely complex and really difficult to implement. I've got some actual personal experience with that, so I implemented parts of DNP3 secure authentication under a US Department of Homeland Security grant, and by the end of that exercise, I had no confidence that I had done it correctly or that my code was secure. And that was a real problem. I think in this space we have a real problem with designing things that may look well on paper, but when someone goes to implement them, all kinds of corner cases and things pop up, and ultimately that leads to a lot of bugs. And then with the 1711 series protocols, one of the primary problems that I've seen is the only way that they have to kind of root trust is with shared secrets. There's absolutely no support for public keys. So you pretty much are stuck if you have a large system trying to manage just mountains of shared secrets and figuring out how to get that shared secret securely from your SCADA master to your outstation, and that can be a real problem. And of course, there are various vendor proprietary solutions out there, but this isn't 1995. We want our things to talk to each other from different vendors, right? So that's not something they were even particularly interested in. Well, the other question I get a lot is, well, why not TLS? Tons of people are migrating from serial to IP infrastructure. Why can't we just wrap everything in TLS? And I think for some applications, that's okay, but I'm not convinced that TLS is sort of an optimal protocol for these systems. There are tons of bells and whistles, things that are easy to misconfigure. I've seen systems where they should have been doing mutual authentication and we're only doing server auth. There's tons of extra metadata in X509 that just aren't relevant to these systems. Simple examples, frustrations I've heard from people is that when you provision an X509 certificate, you either have to fix a domain name or an IP address, right? Well, why is that the case? Why can't I provision certificates before I've assigned an IP address? So there's certain impediments that are sort of embedded in PKI for the web that cause kind of a bit of an impedance mismatch when you try to use these technologies on an industrial control system. And then, I don't know if everybody's like me. Has anyone ever actually looked at the draft, the IET draft for TLS 1.3? Nobody goes home on a Friday night and cracks open a bottle of wine and reads internet RFCs? Okay, so there's probably some surprises in there. First of all, TLS 1.3 is not going to have any authentication-only modes. Thou shalt use encryption, period. And that's a great thing for the web, right? Care a lot about confidentiality, but for these systems where we might want to do more monitoring than just who's talking to who at the network, communications layer, it's not such a great thing. We don't care about confidentiality in most cases of the actual, SCADA data traffic. Well, you say, well, that's not so bad, right? I can just go put private keys on my monitoring appliances and decrypt the traffic and save that 24 hours of history. I mean, that's a questionable decision in itself because you're threatening, you're putting that secret on the one more thing where the secret can be stolen from. But TLS 1.3 won't even let you do that. So every single one of the modes in 1.3 will only support perfect forward secrecy. So unless you want to get in the middle of the communications and slow everything down and add extra latency, you're not even going to be able to do passive monitoring. So given that we didn't feel industry efforts and IT protocols were always optimal, the way we started with this project was just requirements analysis. And it always came back to number one was simplicity of implementation. And with this first requirement, we made a commitment that as we developed a specification, we were going to also develop a reference implementation. So we'd have a working version of the protocol that we could test in the lab and iteratively define the spec as we wrote the specification. Number two, we wanted a flexible basis of trust. We didn't want to be pigeonholed into just using shared secrets. We wanted to be able to support pre-shared public keys, kind of like you would use PGP email, where everybody has out-of-band knowledge of other people's public keys, like a key server. And we knew we also wanted some type of a PKI scheme with lightweight certificates. We also knew that we needed to support lossy, I won't say serial and IP, let's reframe that as lossy and lossless communication layers. So with serial, some of your frames might drop, they might not get there, parts of it might get corrupted. A lot of ICS protocols use UDP, where in the absence of an adversary, your whole packet usually gets there or it doesn't, but packets might come out of order. And we didn't want to have separate protocols for sort of all these different types of transports. And then really importantly, because we'd like to be able to run this protocol on systems that have, if not real-time, near real-time timing requirements, we wanted to minimize the impact of both the messages themselves and especially the handshake. So I don't know if you've ever seen TLS 1.1, 1.2 in action, but how it's typically configured is you have two out and back message exchanges to set up that session, right? So we really wanted to get that down to as few additional messages as possible in the design of the protocol so we'd have fewer hiccups if we were running this on a real-time system. So just requirements continued. I don't think I'll go through all of these. The second one is particularly interesting. So one concept that we borrowed from the 1711 series of protocols was the concept of a time of validity. So something that TLS doesn't have is being able to timestamp something like a control message with a TTL. And the semantics would sort of be, if you get this and it's expired by the time you get it, don't process it. So to avoid scenarios where attacker can kind of give it in the middle of your communication, hold back a series of control commands and then replay them in a rapid order. So we wanted the protocol to have some concept of a TTL. So over the last year, we've been working on the specification. It's not quite open source yet, but as soon as legal review is done, it will be. And until it finds a standards body's home, we plan to keep it available on GitHub. There's a project there where you can, it's all in Markdown. You can create a PDF or HTML, and we'll host all of that. So that's where it will be when it is available. And then with that said, now we're going to get really down into the weeds and talk about some of the mechanics of the protocol itself. So, in the various modes of the protocol, no matter whether you're using shared secrets or pre-shared public keys or certificates, the protocol handshake always has these same messages. In the first message, the initiator, which would typically be something like a SCADA master, something that wants to acquire measurement values and then maybe change the process state periodically, sends a message called request handshake begin to the responder, which would typically be something like an outstation or a PLC or a RTU. And then if the responder supports everything in the request, the outstation sends back reply handshake begin. And each of those modes, you'll see in the next few slides, those messages are interpreted slightly differently based on how you set up your keys, whether you're using shared secrets or public keys. And then after that's done, the two sides basically will have performed key agreement. They'll have a shared set of session keys that will only match if nothing's been tampered with and the two sides are who they claim to be. But you haven't actually authenticated in that first set of messages. And then here's the trick that we basically employ to get down to a one round trip handshake. To authenticate, we send a session data message from each party with the message counter or not sent to 0, and optionally, some payload data. So we use that first payload message to actually authenticate each party. So that's what reduces latency. So if you're connecting to a device for the first time, you really only have one out and back before you're able to send that payload data. Now before I get into sort of what are in the messages themselves and how the crypto works, I think it's important to say how we're defining messages and how we're handling serialization. So we decided to go with kind of a lightweight grammar of our own invention. Who's actually looked at ASN1? Have you seen ASN1 before? Yeah, a few people in the audience. How about Google Protobuf? Okay, I see 2 people. These are just schemas for defining things, and then a set of serialization rules that actually specify how that gets transformed into bytes on the wire. So we've done the same thing, but this grammar is really targeted at embedded systems, and it's targeted at security type messages where you want a high assurance that you don't have a bug in your parser because you haven't actually authenticated where the data is coming from. So the end goal of all is to specify the messages much like you'd specify any type of a schema, run it through a compiler, and spit out basically bindings for a particular language so that people writing implementations of this protocol don't have to really worry about parsing. You don't have to know all the details of the semantics of these schemas to kind of get an idea of what's going on here. That begin handshake request message, every message starts with a function code that identifies what the message is. There's a version number. And then the next field is the handshake mode. And this is where the initiator is basically saying, am I doing shared secrets, pre-shared public keys, or certificates? The next field is what we call a crypto spec. And this is basically the initiator saying, these are the algorithms I want to use for the handshake and for the session. So in TLS, you would probably see this called a cipher suite, right? We don't call it a cipher suite because we might not be using any ciphers at all. Being an authentication-only protocol, we thought it might be better to name this more generically. This argument places some limits on the session. The initiator can sort of apply principle of least privilege here and say, I only want to open a session for this period of time or until I've sent this number of messages, instead of kind of opening an unbounded session. And then the last two fields are interpreted based on that handshake mode. So the meanings of those change depending on whether you're using those shared secrets, public-private key pairs, or certificates. And the next slide kind of shows what those meanings of those different things are. So for the shared secret, the ephemeral data is literally just a random nonce. Comes right out of that cryptographically secure random number generator and into the message. In pre-shared public key mode, it's an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key. And in the certificate mode, you have the Diffie-Hellman key plus the mode data set to a certificate change so that you can kind of dynamically get that validate and get that public key from the other party. Okay, deep breath. Finally time to do some crypto here. So here's how the key agreement handshake works with shared secrets. So with shared secrets, both parties, just think of your master and your outstation, share some 256-bit key, right? We're not addressing here how they get configured or how those are initially deployed. And the first thing that happens is the initiator sends that begin handshake request along with the algorithms he wants. But the important kind of different field for the mode here is that 32-byte random nonce. And both sides initialize a hash of the whole message. They take the whole message, they hash it with something like SHA-256, and they save that hash value. Now, if the responder supports everything in that request, it replies with a begin handshake reply message, and it mixes the received message into the hash. So after these first two messages, both parties have a value of H that will be the same unless somebody tampered with something, right? If anybody modified either of those two messages, H won't be the same. And then for key agreement in the shared secret mode, we use a primitive called HKDF. This is a ITF RFC. You go look it up. It's actually the key derivation function that TLS 1.3 uses. And we care about two parameters. We care about a salt and an input key material. Salt is something that can be public and different. So any passive person could look at this network traffic and basically produce a value for H. Input key material must have at least a certain number of bits of something known only to the two parties. So in this case, it's the shared secret with the two nonces appended to the end. Out of that pops out two session keys that we can then use to send traffic in either way for our session. I think I'm going a little slower than I thought, so I'm going to skip some of the bullets here. Key agreement for the public key modes is very, very similar in the sense that you keep a running hash of the key agreement handshake. Instead of the nonces, each party transmits an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key so that you have that perfect forward secrecy if you want encryption. And then optionally, there's a public key transmitted embedded in a certificate. It might not be there in the pre-shared public key mode if the two parties already know each other's public keys. And then for the input key material argument to the key derivation function, you do what's called a triple Diffie-Hellman, and you kind of do Diffie-Hellman operations against the ephemeral and static keys respectively. And those two values won't agree unless the parties have the Diffie-Hellman keys private Diffie-Hellman keys that they claim to have. Okay. So after that key derivation step, everything in the protocol is the same no matter what mode you're in. You have your two session keys, you're ready to authenticate each other, and you're ready to possibly start transmitting payload data. So you perform the key agreement, and the keys, those time constraints, that set of algorithms, they all go into what we call kind of a pending session because you don't yet know, you haven't yet authenticated the remote party. You wait until you get a session data message that authenticates with a nonce equal to 0. And at that point, you basically throw out any other pre-existing session, or you initialize a session if you didn't have one, and you're off to the races. You're sending your authenticated messages back and forth in each direction. Brief slide about the session messages themselves. They're really not that different than session messages in other security protocols. This is where that concept of the message TTL comes in, though. So that second field called metadata that is a auth metadata, it contains the nonce and the message TTL that allows the two parties to detect kind of like time skewing or tampering. And then the other two fields are basically the user data, which may or may not be encrypted, depending on the mode. It might just be plain text. And the authentication tag that in either mode lets you tell that it comes from the party that basically you did the handshake with. So that's it for the low-level crypto details. I want to talk a little bit more now just about the open source reference implementation, kind of where we're going with this project in terms of standardization and so forth. So the reference implementation is kind of currently hosted on private GitHub. If anyone's interested in this or the spec, we can get you access. It's all kind of release pending us getting approval from the Public Utility Commission. And since you know that public utility commissions have tons of lawyers on staff that under open source, that'll go really smoothly, right? Now it's really taking a while. But what we envision for this is having a true open source project with a project page, a continuous integration system that runs tests, all that sort of infrastructure that you would expect from open source projects that you might consume for other things. And it's important to say that the license will encourage broad commercial adoption, and we're going to go with a BSD style license. Some technical highlights about the actual reference implementation. We chose to go with sort of really a lightweight subset of C++ because we wanted people to use the reference implementation in embedded systems. So one of the core rules was it doesn't do heap allocation after initialization. So you can run this on something reliably that doesn't have a memory management unit. No exceptions in the core library. So it really is C++ kind of subsetted for embedded systems. We're using libsodium as sort of the default crypto library. But as soon as some of the primitives that we use land in the next version of OpenSSL, we'll also be able to use that as a backend. And then as I was mentioning before, we don't have any manually written parsers. So everything in terms of parsing code, parsing messages is automated. And right now we're kind of doing that by using a domain-specific language. So we model the messages that you saw in the spec there in a DSL. It's actually written in a language called SCADA. And that spits out the C++ classes that basically handle reading, writing the messages, pre-printing things to the console for debugging purposes and all that stuff. So the next phase of our project is really going to be focused on what we're calling industrial key infrastructure. We don't say PKI. PKI should just mean public key infrastructure, public being public-private key pairs. But unfortunately, that name is so overloaded that when you say PKI to people, they think, oh, web PKI. Really? You're going to have utilities go to some third party? Like, no. We envision all this being done with an authority that the asset owner completely 100% controls. So just to avoid those overloaded semantics, we're calling this IKI. Now, this diagram is very notional and hand-wavy. So this is kind of where we've gotten to this point in the project. But the next phase will all be about basically developing the different patterns and even producing some prototypes for a certificate authority. We have done some prototyping with the certificates themselves, and we have those prototypes working within the reference implementation. So if you think about what a certificate is, it's really just an envelope with some certificate data that's signed by somebody you trust. You perform that verification step, and then you parse the innards, and the innards might contain things like a serial number. It definitely is going to contain your public key. It might also contain some timing constraints and possibly some extensions. So we envision embedding things in the extensions like granular permissions. So modbus.org, for instance, might specify an extension for Modbus that allows to say that this particular certificate should only give the bearer read access, for instance. No write coils, no write multiple coils, those sorts of things. So that's one of the ways in which we envision extensions being used. So given a few assumptions, namely 32-byte keys, 64-byte signatures, and no extensions, we're down to a certificate size of 129 bytes. So if you're using RSA and X509, you're already looking at multiple K. So if you're thinking about doing things with near-field communications or 1200 baud serial links, this will be a certificate format that you can use over low bandwidth. So to date, basically phases 1 through 7, we've got those 3 modes defined in the spec and working in the reference implementation. Phase 8 will be the beginning of the IKI, along with, we're doing some prototyping with quantum key distribution, but that's more of an aside. And all of this will lead into Department of Energy grant that we've won called DOE SEDS. And SSP-21 was one of 20 projects selected. The total award pool is $20 million. We don't know how much of that we're going to get, but it's a project led by Lawrence Livermore. And then SDGE, our vendor is Cooper Power Systems. We have one more major US vendor that I can't mention yet, also interested. And of course, I'll be involved on the protocol side. And as I said before, all this will be open source. We'd like contribution from vendors. Does it meet your use cases? From utilities, does it meet your use cases? Probably, to get official access, the best person to email is Rich Corrigan. That's the email address. But if you email me, I can always put you in touch with Rich. We'd love to hear from you. And that's it. I think I have some time for questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was an interesting project, really. So you mentioned how long have you been working with the project?
A little over a year.
Okay.
A year and change, yeah.
Okay. We'll see. We have actually got a lot of questions for you. Oh, there's very direct. So why not use the OPC-UA/IEC 62541?
So I'll have to ask a question back. Is that OPC wrapped in TLS, or is that embedded security for OPC? Does anyone know?
Who is responsible for that question?
I'm not familiar with that particular IEC standard, but I'd say if it's OPC wrapped in TLS, then I would say most of the criticisms of TLS would apply. If it's embedded OPC, if it's embedded security for OPC, like it is for DNP3 secure authentication or IEC 101 or 104, then the complexity criticisms would apply.
We skip to the next one. Has SSP-21 been formally verified?
Great question. We're talking to two research groups that we're vetting to perform this. One's a group at Stanford and another is a group at Oxford. So we're keenly interested as part of that DOE grant doing 3 or 4 different types of analysis. We'd like a really good cryptographic expert to look at the protocol. We'd like somebody from a company like IOActive. I have a couple people in mind there actually to look at the reference implementation. And we really want to have formal verification done. Not only does it give you that feather in your cap and confidence that the protocol is correct, but it also forces you to flush all the ambiguities out of your spec.
Mm-hmm. Okay, get the chance to jump onto this project then. Any SCADA or equipment vendors in the SSP-21 project?
Yes, so Cooper Power Systems, which is a subdivision of Eaton, is officially part of the DOE grant. And I have one other major US vendor who's also committed to the project. So we have two pretty big vendors on the project, yep.
Does this protocol support CBC?
Is that cipher block chaining? If it is, we specifically aren't using CBC modes of encryption. All the encryption modes are so-called authenticated encryption modes. So they're the encryption and the authentication as a package. And that's pretty consistent with where TLS has moved. There tend to be a lot of errors when you kind of combine encryption and authentication together. Programmers tend to make mistakes.
How long will it take until this gets adopted by vendors? Well, you already have 2.
That's the $20 million question,
yeah,
right? I mean, this industry is so slow, and it takes a long time to roll these out. I really don't have a good answer for you there. My hope would be that we might see this as a commercially available product within, say, 2 to 3 years.
Oh,
but it's a chicken or the egg thing. You have to have enough people implementing the master software and enough people implementing the outstation.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's the tricky one.
Yep.
If the big utility companies in California mandates this technology protocol, is it designed to be in products available globally?
That's really my hope, is that since this is being driven by people that have the needs and the budget, that this won't be like past efforts that have kind of fallen by the wayside.
Yeah.
California has an economy and population bigger than most countries in Europe. So I'm hoping that they have enough financial mass and sway with vendors that we can actually eventually write this into RFQs.
Because this will be an open specification.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't see the point why you should use it just only for your hometown.
Right.
So can data piggybacked in SSP-21 handshakes prior to course resource exhaustion? Oh, sorry, prior to course resource exhaustion. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Do you get it sort of slightly?
I don't necessarily think so any more than any other protocol. We have sort of, you can configure bounds on how much data you allow in the messages, and those would kind of fail prior to the actual authentication step if someone tried to specify too much data. So I don't think we have a problem there different than any other protocol. The cryptography that's performed at that step, the authentication, is pretty lightweight. It's actually just an HMAC, with symmetric cryptography. We'd actually have more impact from somebody just continuously sending us those request session begin messages, because that's where you're doing multiple Diffie-Hellman operations. So I actually think that case would be worse, at least for CPU exhaustion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that was the final question. Yes.
Great questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah.